All right, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Alexandra Campbell Ferrari, and I'm the Executive Director for the Center for Water Security and Cooperation. We are a 501(c)(3) nonprofit focused on ensuring that law and practice guarantee water security and universal access to water and sanitation. I'm joined by my colleague Morgan Shimabuku. She is a senior research specialist with the Pacific Institute and a fellow co-author of the series that we'll be talking about today. I do want to share that Shannon McNeely, who's also a colleague and co-author on this report, wanted us to share her disappointment in not being able to join us today, but she has had a family emergency come up, so we're sending her our thoughts today. Uh, we will be discussing a really exciting series of reports that we've been putting out over the past 2 years. The focus is on the final one that we just put out with respect to legal solutions that enable climate resilient water and wastewater infrastructure and services. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Morgan to set the scene for what we'll be discussing today. Take it away, Morgan.
Great. Yeah, I will, unless you wanted to present the agenda, I'm happy to give a quick overview. So today we will share a little project background, and then sort of walk through these questions. Why should communities and utilities, uh, why should communities and utilities be concerned? Why do we need to care about law and policy? How do you know if your laws and policies are helping you or hurting you with regard to climate change? And how is this framework actually being put into action? And then we will have time at the end, hopefully, for lots of questions and answers from you all. So diving into the series. So we work together with the Center for Water Security and Cooperation, as well as dig deep to produce this series on climate change impacts to water and sanitation in the United States. This is the first report in that series, and this just quickly showing sort of a background of the information within these reports. So this one really helped to outline the impacts of climate change on water and sanitation systems in the United States, especially for frontline communities. The next report was this laws and policies that address water and sanitation and climate change. And this one actually helped lay the groundwork for what we're going to be discussing today. The third report was around achieving equitable climate resilient water and sanitation for frontline communities, really looking at strategies and approaches that communities are using today to build climate resilience and to adapt their water and sanitation systems to climate change. So today's focus is really going to land on this fourth report, which we recently published at the end of last year, and not so much going into the details of the report, but actually walking through the framework that we present and the criteria we present. This report really distills a lot of complex legal and policy systems into more clear and actionable guidance. And we do that around 6 core legal attributes. And then within each attribute, a set of criteria that one could use to evaluate whether the laws and policies within the jurisdiction that you're looking at help to protect water and sanitation from climate change. And we also, in this report, detail over 60 real-world legal strategies that are in place that communities, states, and the federal government even use to advance equitable climate resilient water and sanitation. And so we really envision that this body of work, can help frontline communities, utilities, law and policy makers, and even advocates with assessing whether current federal, tribal, state, or local laws help to or hinder climate change preparedness and response. So I was just going to go through 6 different climate phenomena that we address in this report series and really articulate some high-level details on how climate change is already affecting water and sanitation access in the United States. So extreme hot and cold, this has a number of impacts to water access and water availability and safety. Extreme temperatures can contribute to water quality degradation. In extreme heat, there's a huge increase in demand for water, which can put a strain on water systems. Extreme heat and cold can really compound health risks, especially for the most vulnerable, such as elderly populations, outdoor laborers, and those experiencing homelessness. And then a lot of times, extreme heat and cold can lead to power outages, which disrupt water and sanitation services. Drought is another phenomena that we discuss, and the most obvious impact of drought is the reduced water availability, and that can lead to water systems and wells drying up and not having water available when it's needed. Depletion of groundwater when there's a dependence on that. And then a lot of the research really shows there's highly disproportionate impacts for rural communities and those who depend on shallow wells during droughts. Um, The other next phenomena is inland flooding. So this is really flooding around rivers or even flash flooding in communities from intense precipitation events, which are becoming more common and more extreme. And so inland flooding is actually one of the most costly and growing risks in the United States right now because of these extreme precipitation events. And these events are well known to cause extensive damage to all kinds of infrastructure, including water and sanitation systems. Hurricane Helene even though that was a hurricane and started on the coast, it traveled inland, of course, in places like North Carolina, causing extensive damage and taking water systems offline for many, many days. These floods also lead to a lot of contamination events of water supplies and can be especially disproportionately impactful in higher percentage Black communities relative to communities with a smaller percentage Black population. Sea level rise is another climate-related phenomena that has a lot of impacts to water and sanitation systems. Wastewater treatment systems often located right along water bodies, including ocean, and bays, and where sea level rise will contribute to damage and over time take these systems offline. That then, of course, impacts not just the people on the coast themselves, but people inland who are being served by these wastewater systems. Sea level rise also combined with drought can cause a lot of challenges for small public water systems. For example, in the Mississippi River Basin, there's been times when due to higher sea levels combined with drought on the Mississippi, water from the ocean has traveled inland and from the delta has traveled inland and contaminated water supplies for small drinking water systems along the river. And saltwater intrusion can also be a challenge for groundwater supplies and contaminate groundwater to make it undrinkable for those communities. The last two phenomena I'll touch on are the impacts of extreme storms. So these include hurricanes, but then also tornadoes and other storms such as those. These do a lot of damage to the infrastructure themselves and then also to energy systems, which again, when you take out a power system, the electricity, water and sanitation systems can no longer run. And if they aren't able to have backup power or sufficient backup power, that can leave people without running water and sufficient wastewater services. These storms definitely damage water quality and contaminate water supplies. They also contaminate just the floodwaters around, leading to higher exposure of water-related infectious disease. They contribute also to further saltwater intrusion. And again, there's a lot of research showing that extreme storm events disproportionately impact Black, Hispanic populations, as well as people with disabilities and low-income communities in the United States. The final phenomena we discuss are wildfires. These can destroy or severely damage water distribution systems, including the pipes and the wells. They contaminate surface water and groundwater in the near term as well as short term with things like heavy metals and volatile organic compounds and sediment. And households that are impacted by wildfires, often there's been findings of melted and ruptured water pipes or water meters and damaged and destroyed domestic wells. At community scale, there are adverse impacts to the water intake system and water treatment systems, and even reduced reservoir lifespans due to the worsening erosion and sedimentation behind the reservoir. So that's just a brief high-level overview of some of the impacts we're seeing in the literature and what we've outlined in our reports. And hopefully the things that we think law and policy should be able to at least help us prepare better for in the long run. So Alexandra, back to you.
Thanks, Morgan. Here we'll start to focus on the law and policy aspect of the work that we've been doing. So the question that I often get in talking about law in the context of infrastructure is why? Why do we need to care about a bunch of words on a page that largely and often don't make any sense when it comes to actually delivering water and wastewater services that are very tangible? It's something that has to be delivered to your doorstep. It requires pipes. So how is legal infrastructure similar to that kind of gray infrastructure? And so my response is that first, legal infrastructure are the laws, they're the implementing regulations, they're all the institutions that are established by law, and they all inform, determine, and guide the decisions that we make. So the idea behind law is that we're setting some kind of foundation at a jurisdictional level, whether it be at the federal level, the state level, the local level, and we're saying these are the rules that we want to apply to all the situations. So when it comes to water and wastewater, especially the delivery of services, we want to make sure that it's pretty equal when we're talking about the quality, the reliability, the safety of those services across an entire country, really across the entire world. And so the law helps to set that foundation by saying, hey, here are the rules that everyone needs to follow when it comes to delivering those services, the quality of the services, the safety of those services, the consistency, the underlying building requirements, things like that. And so what does smarter laws mean? They mean really better services, more reliable services, safer services. And later on, I'm going to talk about specific examples. Actually, we'll both talk about specific examples related to that intersection of water and sanitation and climate change. But I wanted to provide kind of two broader services as to how laws hurt and help people. So one is in the United States, there's something called the Safe Drinking Water Act. It was passed in 1974, and it requires that drinking water meet certain levels called maximum contaminant levels in order to protect human health. So without those kinds of federal standards, it would be up to states or utilities individually to define what can and cannot be found in drinking water being delivered to people. So again, going back to the original theme of we want this standard set of rules that apply to something so significant as human health. The second example from the Safe Drinking Water Act is actually more of an institutional feature that ensures that there's public participation in the process. So the Safe Drinking Water Act establishes something called the National Drinking Water Advisory Council. And this is a group of experts and members of the public that are selected by EPA to provide advice and guidance to EPA over a three-year term. So the importance of that is that there's seats that are available for members of the public and experts at utilities and utility associations and other groups to get feedback or to get updates from EPA and then be able to provide advice and different perspectives on what EPA should be doing. The third example comes from the Clean Water Act, and similarly, the Clean Water Act is a federal law. It was passed in 1972, and it prohibits pollution without a permit. So states could equally and have equally passed laws that share those prohibitions, but this applies across the country. And so it again creates that kind of baseline expectation about what pollution control looks like. So these are just some broader examples of how and why law is important to the work that we're doing here. Next slide. Morgan, I think, provided an excellent overview of this relationship between climate change and water and sanitation services. And every time I hear it, I get more and more overwhelmed because there's so many ways that climate change impacts water and sanitation. And so then the question becomes, well, what does that even look like in the legal space? And I can tell you, actually, we can all tell you, it's a lot. There's a lot of information. So what you'll notice is that we focused on some very key basic attributes that relate to this intersection. But really, this started with an overall examination of that relationship of the laws that are governing climate change as they relate to the provision of water and wastewater services. So we did the second series in the report focused on that relationship, examining what existed today at the federal, state, and sometimes local level. Of course, that is not a fully comprehensive analysis, but it gives you this sense as to what's going on across the United States. So we tried to provide and get examples from different states across the United States to give you a taste of what it looks like, what the landscape looks like across all 50 states. We realized how overwhelming that was. And we said, okay, it's great that we have this, but how do we make this actionable? How do we actually create something that somebody could use, right? Not just an informational piece, not some more data and information, all helpful, all help us to understand this relationship, but what can we do to actually create something that communities, that elected officials, that other people can use to inform what our laws and policies and institutions really need to look like in order to manage this growing impact of climate change on our services. And so we established this framework that, as I mentioned earlier, identifies the most essential and basic attributes, strategies, and criterias for laws that enable equitable, climate resilient water and sanitation. Next slide. So there are 6 broad attributes. And then in this table here, there's actually a table in the report, and I put a link to the series in the chat that hopefully you can access. But the series will link you to all 4 reports that have been published. The 4th report is the one that we're really focused on today, that focuses on this WASH law framework. This is just a taste because there's a lot of different criteria that have been included that Morgan and I are going to walk through just a few of them today. But in terms of the attributes, there's really 6 of them. And so the first are design and construction requirements that are specifically relating to climate change. So what are the requirements that inform how we build our water and wastewater infrastructure? What are they saying when it comes to building in a flood zone? What are they saying when it comes to addressing droughts? So that's one attribute. A second is, how do you ensure that water uses in frontline communities during climate disruptions are legally protected? So how do you make sure that in this world of competing water uses, which is just growing, right? With data centers and AI and other things, there's even more strain on how much water that we're using. How do we make sure that in the event that there isn't enough water to support all of those uses, that we have enough water to fulfill our domestic and municipal needs, i.e. that we can fulfill drinking water and sanitation needs? The third is planning. So what kind of requirements are in place to collect data and information and allow us to plan for the delivery of these services in light of the impacts of climate change? The fourth is data collection, monitoring, and reporting, and ensuring that laws require that is a component of the responsibilities of utilities. The fifth is ensuring equitable distribution of climate resilient infrastructure funding. So funding is a key part of this. Laws are responsible for appropriations. And so how do we not only ensure that laws are appropriating the funding, but also that it's being equitably distributed to the communities who need it? And Morgan talked a lot about the fact that there are numbers of disproportionate impacts on Black and Brown communities and other types of communities who are just getting hit by climate impacts and don't necessarily have the funding to respond to those. So we'll touch a little bit on the rule of law in that context. And then lastly, enforcement. So I always talk about that the law is the first thing, right? You have to have the words on a page. You have to have a common understanding of the rules that we're all being governed by. But then those words on the page have to come to life. They have to mean something. And that means enforcing them. That means ensuring that somebody is following them. That if someone isn't following them, that there are consequences. And so the law determines what those processes are, what the actual consequences are. And you want to make sure that they're not only proportionate to the non-compliance, but that they're incentivizing compliance with the law and not undermining the actual meaning and implementation of the law. So that's the sixth and final attribute of our report. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Morgan, who will do a bit of a deep dive into one attribute and a few criteria.
Thanks. So, yeah, this is sort of trying to address the question using the wash law framework of how do you know if your laws are helping you or hurting you, like Alexandra suggested. And I'm going to first touch on some of examples specifically from the first attribute around siting, design, and construction requirements that address climate change. Um, the first criterion within the that attribute is around codes and standards requiring water and sanitation structures and equipment to be elevated or protected from flooding, wildfire, and other climate phenomena. And there are a number of different ways that governments and utilities and laws really can tell them to do that. Um, so, for example, these laws could require the use of best available science on climate change risks when putting codes and standards out. Governments could adopt standards to be more stringent than those that are currently used by state and federal agencies like FEMA, or that specifically have not yet done a lot to incorporate climate change considerations. Um, Third, uh, the rules governing rehabilitation or rebuilding of water and wastewater infrastructure after a disaster has occurred could require that the groups rebuilding those build to a higher standard and anticipate and incorporate the climate risks. So I do want to provide just a couple specific examples that come from a couple different states and places around the country. So, in the state of New York, after Hurricane Sandy, the state adopted a more rigorous standard for critical equipment and other storm-related measures for projects to be eligible for funding from the state revolving fund program. So those standards, for example, were that critical equipment had to be either above a 100-year flood level plus 5 feet, above the Sandy high water mark plus 4 feet, or above the 500-year flood level. And you don't need to know exactly what all of those mean, but it's basically placing our critical infrastructure out of the way of what we have seen in the past and what we predict in the future high water and flooding levels will be at. And so this goes beyond what FEMA currently, the Federal Emergency Management Agency's federal standards are, and will hopefully help incentivize those who are installing this critical equipment and infrastructure to have to elevate their infrastructure. A second example is around wildfires, which have at the federal level had a lot less attention around standards and codes than flooding in general. But with things like the fires that devastated Los Angeles last year, the wildfires in Hawaii, and in many other places, there are a new sort of focus on standards and codes that can help prevent such massive devastation to communities and their water and sanitation systems. So in the report, we highlight the International Code Council's Wild and Urban Interface Code that offers, it's a model code that states or local governments can adopt and incorporate land use rules and building codes to help reduce the impact or likelihood that wildfires will spread into urban areas. And this hopefully will help, by reducing that spread into urban areas, will hopefully reduce the likelihood that water systems or wastewater systems will be damaged and destroyed. And one really neat example comes actually from the island of Kauai in Hawaii, where the city council fairly recently passed passed an ordinance in 2025 to embed fire mitigation and fire resistant home improvements and defensible space standards into their building codes. in places known as plantation camps, which are residential communities in places with historical and cultural significance to those local peoples. So those are just two examples of the way that siting, design, and construction requirements can begin to address climate change. Alexandra, back to you for another example.
I wanted to focus on the enforcement aspect. I think it's kind of the unsung hero in a lot of this work is that once you do, as I mentioned earlier, once you do set out the rules and the requirements, it's important that there's follow-up with that. And so there were a few different criteria that there's one criteria that we looked at with respect to ensuring that the law does create those opportunities for enforcement, but specifically that the public is able to get involved. One thing that we often forget is that our laws are written by legislators, but there are other opportunities for citizen engagement or resident engagement in lawmaking and enforcement. So we often expect our legislators to make our laws, and we expect our state agencies and our local agencies and local governments and our federal governments to enforce them. And that all should be the case. But citizens have these amazing opportunities when given in the law to partake in that. So on the lawmaking side, there are some states that allow for resolutions, right? So California is famously known for allowing citizens to adopt resolutions or propose resolutions, and that become part of the legal landscape. What I'm going to focus on is more of the citizen suit. So when the government isn't doing what it is required to do under the law, or when an action isn't being taken by the government to hold a certain party, for example, someone, a discharger, accountable for the requirement to get a NIPDES permit or to comply with the effluent limits in their NIPDES permit, there is a citizen suit provision within the Safe Drinking Water Act that allows for citizens to bring a civil action against a person or a governmental agency for violating the law or violating an order that the government has issued. And so this is a really important mechanism that a lot of nonprofits use to ensure that the law is in fact enforced. And it's not just because the government isn't doing its job, is that there's a lot to do. If you look at the database, the ECHO database, it gives you a sense as to how many water and wastewater utilities and other NIPDES permit holders are in or out of compliance with their permit limits. And so you get a sense as to what actions the government is taking, if they're under consent decree, if they've been notified, what kind of administrative processes have been taken. But it gives you a sense as to how many are in and out of compliance and how much work has to be done by local, state, and federal government to ensure compliance with the law. And so having mechanisms like the citizen suit provision is really important to empowering other resource nonprofits and other groups to support the implementation and enforcement of the law. So that is one strategy that we highlight, that when you're not just dealing with federal law, you also want to make sure that your state laws reflect that. So in many instances, states rely on the fact that there are citizen suit provisions in the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act. But if there are certain scopes of the law that are no longer covered within the federal law, so for example, the change in the definition of waters of the United States has changed the scope of the federal requirements and obligations. And so if you don't have that citizen suit provision at the state level with respect to the waters of the state that, depending on how you define them, but let's say it's differently than waters of the United States, then you need to have a separate citizen suit provision. And so it sounds really technical and wonky, but these kinds of opportunities are important, as I said, for ensuring that citizens, residents, nonprofits, others can ensure that that law is being enforced. Morgan, back to you.
Great. And so I'll talk about just a third attribute and give some examples from our work. So I'm going to focus on the attribute around laws that govern equitable distribution of climate resilient infrastructure funding. And within this, looking at the criteria around appropriation and creating programs that specifically enable climate resilient access to water and wastewater services, or create and extend water and wastewater infrastructure. So that's a big area that needs funding, is actually to build climate resilience, is providing infrastructure to communities that currently lack access. Um, and then there are a number of different ways, this is not an exhaustive list, that laws can do that. As we've repeated, laws create funding mechanisms and they actually appropriate the funding for specific projects or programs. They also create broader funding mechanisms for water and wastewater management and rehabilitation. They help ensure that funding is distributed equitably and can prioritize funding for lower income communities. And they can require that project funding with federal and state appropriation prioritize or advance climate adaptation and resilience. So there's a number of examples to discuss at different levels of the government. The America Water Infrastructure Act, or AWIA, really enables funding projects identified within emergency response plans. So these emergency response plans are required by the AWIA to be developed by water systems, and then the funding the funding from that bill can be used for projects within these plans. And they specifically state that they can be used for increasing the resilience of community water systems. Another major one, probably the largest pot of funding for water and wastewater systems in the United States, with opportunities for that funding to support climate resilience, are the two state revolving funds created by the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Clean Water Act. So these funds are sustained through loan payments, interest payments, and new appropriations from Congress. And certain conditions from the federal government apply for how these funds are receiving funds. But states at the state level ultimately distribute the funds through what are called intended use plans, or IUPs. So in these, the states can actually add stipulations that promote or prioritize projects that build climate resilience. So, for example, an IUP can be include targeted ranking criteria that more highly favors projects that build climate resilience. Or there can be financing incentives like reduced interest rates set at the state level for climate adaptation projects. And currently, like I was saying, the SRF programs together are the largest source of federal funding for water and wastewater infrastructure. The appropriations bill that was passed in Congress in January of this year did maintain fiscal year 2025 funding levels through fiscal year 2026 for the state revolving funds, which is $1.64 billion for the Clean Water SRF and $1.13 billion for the Drinking Water SRF. However, within that bill, the appropriations bill, there was a lot of funding was already earmarked for certain specific projects. So that leaves less dollars for the states to ultimately decide what projects are going to be getting the funding. But still a really important bucket of funds for water and sanitation and for climate resilience in the US. And then I'll just highlight two state programs because states also can be instrumental in creating and passing laws that create funding programs or financing programs to support climate resilience. So one major example comes from California. In 2014, they had a proposition passed called Prop 1. And really, this proposition was motivated by the need to reduce impacts of climate change on watersheds and water supplies. And it authorized over $7.5 billion to fund a whole variety of projects, including things like clean, safe, and reliable drinking water. Texas more recently created a major fund for projects that support climate resilient water systems, although they do not use those terms explicitly. The Texas Water Fund, which was established in 2024, but then supported by voter approval in 2025, approves $1 billion for 10 years, $1 billion each year for 10 years. For a whole variety of water-related projects, and it has a number of different funding mechanisms. They offer grants, low-interest loans, and other things that are some that are designed specifically for economically distressed areas, how they define that in Texas, And these projects can be for a whole range of things like flooding protection, for water infrastructure. It can be for nature-based solutions. It can be used for conservation and efficiency projects, and many, many others. So those are just two examples of state level funds. So the between Alexandra and I, we've hopefully provided some insight into really how you can understand if your laws are really helping or hurting you, and in the sense of are they providing protection or not around climate change for your water and sanitation systems. But of course, the report goes into a lot more detail. And also in a just a minute, we'll be able to have some question and answer period, and would love to hear any questions you all have along these lines. So I'll just sort of wrap up the presentation part of this webinar with a real presentation a little of how we are applying this framework in the real world. We're really excited about this. We have just recently launched a project working with 3 communities in the Mississippi River Basin. These include Blytheville, Arkansas, Natchez, Mississippi, and La Crosse, Wisconsin. And we are working directly with the mayor offices in these communities to identify gaps in their laws and policies, and hopefully co-develop solutions to build more climate resilience for their water and sanitation in these communities. And we really hope that at the end of the day, we'll be able to identify specific draft laws and policies that are ready for adoption in these communities, that can help them to advance their climate resilience. We also are working to provide decision support tools for these communities. And eventually, we will publish this work so that it can be more broadly available and used as an example for other communities through case studies. And at the end of the project, we'll also be presenting a webinar. So watch out for that if you are interested in hearing the outcomes and learning from the lessons that we draw from our work with these 3 communities. With that, should I turn it over to question and answer?
Sure. I want to add just one thing quickly because I will highlight it in the end again, but as we mentioned earlier, this is really about putting this into action. So we've done the research, we've created this framework, and we're working with these communities not only to assist them to ensure that their local and state laws have the kinds of provisions that they need in order to face these growing climate impacts on their water and wastewater treatment plant, which are tremendous in the Mississippi River watershed, especially along the Mississippi River, but really across the watershed. Those communities are experiencing some pretty significant impacts of climate change, particularly flooding and drought and increasing severity of extreme weather events. And so this aspect to really put this into action is a huge next step. But I also invite you to think about if there are communities that you're working with that would be interested in this kind of work. We're happy to talk with you. We're happy to work with you on that. So the objective is to use this as a framework that can support the decisions that you're made and really better position the communities that you are working with, can care about to deal with these impacts. So with that, we'll move into the Q&A. Feel free to put your question or answer into the Q&A. I believe the chat is open as well. So Morgan, we have a question in the chat. Can you comment a little bit on how the Texas Fund is capitalized? Is that something you can speak to now?
How it is capitalized? I don't have the specific details in front of me, but what I can do right now is provide a link that can give you those details. Yeah, I apologize. I don't have the details. I do know that how they designed it was within the larger Texas Water Fund. There are a number sort of sub programs that are specific to different challenges, whether that be reliable water supply or flooding or access to water for vulnerable communities. And across a number of different programs, each community could apply for different types of funding within those. But yeah, beyond that, I don't have the details right here in front of me.
Thanks, Morgan. We have another great question in the Q&A. So Adrian has asked, can you speak to the tension between prioritizing funding infrastructure that is resilient to flooding, such as elevating above a specific flood level, and the fact that many wastewater treatment plants in lower income communities are located in flood-prone areas, with the understanding that relocating treatment plants in communities out of floodplains is generally infeasible? Do we want to talk a little bit about this? Do you want to kick us off?
Am I on mute? Um, no, I'm not. Yeah, it is. I think that every community is going to take a different approach to this, and I don't think there's going to be a one size fits all answer. But that what we're seeing in different places is, there's fortification infrastructure that water treatment plants can build to protect their system. Um, there's also, I think, a lot of communities that are turning to actually do water reuse. So it's reducing the need for discharging the wastewater directly into water bodies and reusing it, whether that be for non-potable uses like irrigating crops or landscapes, which can reduce then the demand on the water supply system to have to collect more water supplies, but specific to yeah, relocating treatment plants in floodplains, I agree that in many cases it's not going to be a completely, you know, sort of there's not going to be a sort of way to lift them up and take them directly out of a floodplain, and so there's going to need to be more fortification and also just thoughtful placement of treatment plants. And in cases along again the coast where it's sea level rise impacted, that is requiring in certain places actual retreat. There's right now communities in Louisiana, Alaska, and other places where extreme weather events combined with sea level rise have accelerated the need for actually retreating and moving completely away from the coast. And so, unfortunately, in some cases, the impact of climate change is such that there's going to have to be very drastic sort of decisions made and changes to our not only our infrastructure but the entire community. Alexandra, I don't know if you want to add to that.
I would. I think this question is particularly great because it's a really challenging question. It's raising, I think there's some provocative components of this that we we'll have to consider more and more. I think as the impacts of flooding grow, I think we may have to consider funding and helping communities to leave those areas. We will have to consider finding and find ways to find funding that will support the just complete reconstruction of certain water and wastewater infrastructure. I think there are already communities in that position where that the communities themselves should be relocating. And again, it's not to there's just tons of questions around that. It's a very controversial topic, and I fully understand that, particularly certain communities who have already been required to move out of areas that were originally theirs. So it's not to be unsensitive to that or insensitive to that. It's to say it's just really bad in certain areas. And so I like the question because I think it represents that we have some difficult times ahead, but we also have some difficult questions ahead of ourselves. I think the last thing I will say in terms of prioritizing funding, and I'll actually answer it in light of Caroline's question as well. This tension just got a whole lot harder because the amount of funding that's available at the federal level has decreased quite a bit for this kind of work. And with respect to even just investing in your water and wastewater infrastructure. And so then that burden falls at the state level. They have to try to find funding. And so they're also, I think they're also being forced to ask themselves, how do we generate the revenue in order to do this, right? So through tax revenues and things like that. And so consequently, this burden is being switched from the federal government to the state governments and then all the way down to the local government. And one of the some of the inequity built into that is that the smaller your your population gets, the smaller your tax base gets, the more that each individual person has to cover the cost of whatever it is that you're doing. And so I don't think this is going to get easier to deal with. I think it's only going to get harder. And it is an area where the law could help to better guide how funding is in fact distributed to different people. I don't see any additional questions in the chat or in the Q&A. Morgan, did you want to add to or answer Caroline's question as well? It's in the chat.
Yeah. Yeah. Is the current environment impacting your work, or does working at the city level facilitate success working directly with communities? How is funding being generated? Um, so from Pacific Institute's perspective, I think my understanding of this question is sort of the current environment being the federal environment around at the federal level around climate equity and related issues. And so if from that perspective, our work luckily has not been very directly impacted. We're not funded through the federal government, and we are an independent, nonpartisan think tank and have been able to maintain our projects with support of foundations and others that believe in this kind of work. But that is not to say that we are very aware that many of our partners and the communities where we work have been very much impacted, and that has a lot of ramifications for the work we are able to do and continue to do with these groups, since it can really limit their capacity to continue working on climate resilience and related projects. So I don't know, Alexandra, if you have a different experience from CWSC's perspective.
I'll just tie it directly to this work, specifically with, who we're working with at the local level, because Morgan talked about the fact that we're working at that local level in three cities that are very differently sized. So Blytheville and Natchez are about 14 to 15,000 in population, whereas La Crosse is closer to 50, 55,000. And it's different. Politics looks very different at the local level. It looks very different at the state level. Yes, I think there are still political parties and there's still an influence from the federal government in terms of what elected leaders who share a certain political party are thinking. I do think that communities who are experiencing the direct impacts of these climate impacts, flooding and drought, I don't think they care what you call it. They know that they're experiencing a flood and that they can't ignore it. And they know that the community members who they know personally, who live next to them or who live around the corner from them, they know that they need help. And so I think that is the difference, that they do live closer to the population that's being impacted. And so there is this sense that the words that we use and the terminology that we use, there's less of a focus on that. And I agree, water infrastructure does have anything. There are certainly national consequences for the decisions that we make at the local and state level. And so I couldn't agree more with that. But I do think it's a different taste and flavor working at the local level that does allow us to avoid some of the political implications of the decisions being made by the current administration. Not seeing any additional questions in the Q&A. I will, if we'll move on to
I
Morgan, did
oh,
you
I
want?
see a couple just popped up.
Ah, yay. Okay, fantastic. Thanks for catching that.
Yeah. So one, I think this would be a great one for you to maybe take a stab at, Alexandra. Adrian asks, is curious about the recommendation to prioritize service to household use after disasters. It's a newer topic, and do you have any specific examples of issues that have arisen around that, and what local communities can do to set the priority in code?
Uh, I think that's a great question. I have not seen a lot in terms of the communities that we're looking at right now, and in terms of some other work that we've done through the CWSC's American Water Access Survey. I've not seen a lot about disaster response. Some of the reason is that our focus has been at the local level. And what I'm finding actually in looking at the three communities that we're working in right now are that some of that's actually dictated by at the county level. So in Arkansas, for example, I'm actually not just looking at Blytheville local law, I'm actually looking at county law. And it's the state law that determines that it's the county who kind of oversees emergency management. So some of it is I'm still exploring myself. I do think I don't have any specific examples on hand for how to do that, but I'd be happy to think through with you what that could look like. And I do think there are ways that could prioritize restoring those services um, to households. I will say we did some work outside of this project in particular. We did some work in Texas where there was a well that had gone dry. It was providing services to a mobile home community. The person that was responsible for overseeing that tried to drill a second hole. It didn't work. There was no water left in that aquifer, and then they left. And so when you looked at the local and state law, there was nothing to protect that community. A lot of it was like, who was responsible when this happens, right? The person who's providing the water services is kind of your go-to. But in these different situations where you have a much more ad hoc isn't the right word, but it feels more ad hoc, where it's a single individual or a smaller company providing services, that is an immediate emergency to a community. And yet there was trying to identify who was going to step in and getting it declared as an emergency, which then would have released funding, was really challenging. And ultimately we were working with some partners, actually the community action agencies there, to get the law changed to better specify who should be responsible for that, and it didn't work out. But even in that, right, wasn't natural disaster per se, but was certainly an emergency, and there wasn't there wasn't a clear process, and then there wasn't a clear like rule of terms of who provides the intermediary services while you're getting the main services back online.
I'll just add that we have seen in laws in different states protecting sort of domestic use to some degree or municipal access to water during times of water scarcity and drought. And so there are some legal precedents for basically saying when water is very scarce, the first or the that municipal users or domestic users, their water use is protected or should be protected in those sort of more drought as an emergency situation. And we do have examples of some of those laws, like from California and a few other places, Kentucky actually, in the paper, although we highlight how not all of those are actually perfectly protective or implemented necessarily in a perfect way. So, yeah.
Well, with that, I know that we're getting close to the end of the hour, so Morgan, would you mind moving it to the next?
Yes.
So I just want to thank you for attending this. I hope that it's been helpful to you. It's a lot of information. In the chat, I mentioned that there is a summary table in the report. It's on PDF page 114. I think it's the actual document page 111. But it provides a really clear overview of all the attributes and criteria that we discussed in the report. And I actually would recommend starting there before you take a look at the report. It'll just make it seem a little less just like a little less information for you. But please do not hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. Our email addresses are below. So for myself or for Morgan and also Shannon, you can include all of us on the information. If you're interested in working with us and there's a community that you think would be interested, we'd welcome that chance to work with you on this. We are, as we said, kind of piloting this in the 3 communities within the Mississippi River watershed. But we'd be happy to do this work with you. And I think some of the questions seem to intimate that there are some communities who need this. So we'd be happy to work with you on that. I also would extend to you that if you have any questions or comments or feedback on the framework that we created, we'd be happy to hear it. I think one of the questions that I had prepared or that we had prepared in advance of this, if there weren't any questions, were what's missing? And as we said earlier, the scope of this is quite big, but it's also very focused with respect to the specific laws that we are targeting right now to just deal with the basic underlying issues. So one thing that we don't hit in very much detail, but that we do kind of mention in passing, are land use and zoning laws. And that's a whole different body of work, but really has a tremendous impact on this work as well. So there's a lot of other topics that we would love to explore and expand this to as well. But we would welcome the work or questions that you have to help us to improve this and expand on it. Morgan, any last words?
No, just thank you so much, everyone, for coming and having, interest in providing these questions. And we hope to hear from some of you or all of you if you want to speak further. And yeah, just noting the last question in the chat that Caroline put in there around how we worked with data centers. So yeah, water use by data centers, both from the direct use for cooling as well as indirect use required for the cooling of the energy systems or electric systems is a really important topic that we're just beginning to get involved with, but haven't done a lot of deep dive on that topic quite yet.
Okay,
Looks like
with that, thank you so much for joining us. It was a pleasure to have your questions. We look forward to hearing from you and have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much. Take care.